October 1942, Ravensbrück. In the infirmary annex behind Block 32, a thin stack of typed protocol sheets sits under a brass paperweight shaped like a scalpel. Each page carries a matrix of prisoner numbers, incision sites, inoculum details, and scheduled temperature checks. Design stamped from Berlin and executed here under Karl Gebhardt's authority. The first subject called is Polish resistance courier Wanda Wilczewska, 24, listed as 4567. Two nurses restrain her while SS physician Fritz Fischer draws a neat line on her left thigh. Herta Oberhäuser prepares the tray. Gauze, a syringe, a vial marked sulfonamide, and a small dish of grit and glass to seed the wound. No anesthesia. The cut is deliberate, 3 centimeters, then contamination pressed into living flesh to mimic a battlefield wound. The protocol requires half the cohort to receive the drug, half to go without. On the desk, a clerk taps the Remington, 102.0 Fahrenheit, rising. The goal, as the sheet states in clinical type, is to prove sulfonamide can reduce gas gangrene and streptococcal sepsis for German soldiers. Scientific justification, a phrase that will become a legal indictment. This is the opening cadence of Gebhardt's program at Ravensbrück. 74 Polish women, the rabbits, selected for health and age, operated on in waves. Some cut and recut as variables shift from muscle to bone to nerve. The mathematics of suffering begins in columns and rows: incision length, infection onset, dosage escalation, while outside the wire, thousands of women march to forced labor. Inside, the experiment escalates. Bone scrapings from the tibia follow muscle lacerations. In later sessions, a nerve is nicked, then sutured, to observe functional recovery. Fischer initials the pages. Oberhäuser notes the dressings. A second tray appears: clamps, bone curettes, silk thread. Wanda's breath shortens as the temperature chart ticks upward. "Hold still," a voice says, not with rage but with procedure. This is how bureaucracy performs harm. Quiet, methodical, documented. The day closes with infection logged in 3 subjects. The protocol sheets, smudged with fingerprint grease, record it without emotion. In Berlin, Heinrich Himmler's office expects results. In the Revier, the Polish women understand the pattern and whisper in the dark. "We endure. Our scars will speak." The term Cannonchen takes hold, rabbits, both a slur and a code of survival. Within a week, blackened tissue appears on 5 legs. Gangrenes sickly advance. Yet the schedule does not pause. There is a calendar for sutures, for cultures, for comparisons. When a bone test is ordered, a narrow chisel kisses the tibia under a canvas drape. Pain is the constant, and the ledger grows heavy. Ravensbrück had been built to house women deemed expendable to the Reich. By 1945, over 100,000 would pass through. The Polish cohort at the heart of Gebhardt's design were young, strong, and, by the experimenter's calculus, resilient enough to survive long enough to produce data. Fischer's operative notes cite streptococcus and clostridium inoculations, temperature sampling at strict intervals, and sulfonamide doses adjusted to demonstrate effect. When the effect fails to appear, the next phase opens: muscle and nerve interventions, then bone. A clerk handwrites a question mark beside "function restored," and the line remains unanswered. In the crematorium logs, anonymous entries increase. Deaths attributed to complications, cause never stating experiment, but the timing leaves little doubt on the ward. Institutional skepticism, beyond the wire, remains the experiment's shield. Early complaints, the ones prisoners smuggle out in letters and whispers, are filed by distant offices as rumor or exaggeration. Inside, the apparatus does not need cruelty to continue. It needs compliance to a schedule. Oberhäuser changes a dressing and signs a corner. Fischer checks a chart and asks for the next subject. The name Gebhardt appears not as a shout, but as a heading: surgical direction, Berlin approval, an umbrella that turns wards into laboratories, numbers fixed to memory, 74 operated upon, at least a dozen dead during or soon after, many more left with permanent damage that will kill slowly in the years to come. The Polish rabbits form a hidden ledger of their own. Names etched under bunk slats, days counted by fevers and sutures. "They call this science," a woman whispers through clenched teeth. but our bodies will tell the truth. A nurse pockets a carbon copy of a protocol page. A prisoner's friend learns to recognize Oberheiser's cursive loop on the dressing notes. In this room, evidence is already being born alongside pain. One day, when the files are seized and the signatures matched, these pages will speak in a different register. No longer procedure, but proof. This cold open fixes the lens on Gebhardt's experiments as they were built to be seen by their authors. Controlled, comparative, justified in the language of medicine. It also fixes the lens on how they will be seen by history. Coerced, unconsented, and lethal. Their metrics, the first strands of a rope called the Nuremberg Code. Ignored in 1942, dismissed as rumor in 1943, the sheets stacked tonight will one day condemn the hands that wrote them. Winter 1943, Ravensbruck's frozen yard crunches under boots as Block 32's ledger swells past 150 entries, each a line of pain converted to procedure. Inside the Revier, Dr. Fritz Fischer adjusts his spectacles over a chart that maps the rabbit's arc. Infection rates above 90%, sulfonamide arms failing to bend the curve, and a new phase opening. Bone scrapings to simulate compound fractures, followed by controlled nerve lesions, to observe functional return. Herta Oberheiser lays out clamps and a narrow chisel. The protocol sheet calls for a tibial window 3 millimeters wide. Polish prisoner 5792, Halina Kryskiewicz, a nurse from Poznan, is next. The crack of bone is small but absolute. A clerk records it with a single keystroke. Done. Function test in 72 hours. Fischer notes, as Oberheiser closes the incision with tidy stitches that will never be allowed to rest. By spring, the cohort swells by additional procedures rather than added bodies. The same 74 women cycled through new variables. Muscle laceration after bone, then a superficial nerve nick that becomes a deeper cut. Comparative dressings applied and removed on schedule to watch infection rage in the control limbs. The signatures repeat. Fischer initials the operative lines. Oberheiser signs the dressings. The heading cites Karl Gebhardt's oversight. Berlin approval, Ravensbruck execution. The mathematics of death begins to stack in the margins. At least a dozen rabbits do not survive the experimental phases or their immediate aftermath. Others wither in the months to follow from infections seeded by design. Death certificates, typed with neutral phrases like complications or exhaustion, never mention the comparison charts they neatly accompany. Institutional skepticism remains the experiment's invisible armor. A visiting delegate from abroad notes, unusual infirmary activity, but files his impressions as unverified. Polish testimonies smuggled by resistance channels land on desks in London and Rome and are stamped rumor. Inside the ward, the escalation looks like routine. A new memo tightens temperature intervals. A culture dish arrives with a fresh strain of streptococcus. A dose table broadens the sulfonamide schedule. When the drug fails to save a limb, the limb becomes data. Gangrene logged, amputation considered, then postponed because the protocol wants to watch sepsis climb. A nurse with careful hands writes down 95.0 beside a bluish calf. The number is a threshold and a verdict. Summer brings a separate, parallel cruelty at the camp. X-ray sterilization on larger groups of women, an atrocity adjacent to but distinct from the rabbit's core protocol. Inside the surgical annex, however, Gebhardt's program stays on its narrow thesis. Battlefield mimic wounds, drugs versus controls, then bone and nerve interventions. The ledger deepens. A page of little squares fills with plus and minus marks. Swelling, discharge, fever, mobility. Someone adds a question mark where sensation should return. It does not. The tempo of procedures outpaces healing, and survivors improvise resistance within the rules, hiding thermometers under blankets to blunt fever curves, trading dressings to confuse an observer's eye. Small victories by hours, not days. Across the wire, the macro picture sharpens in minutes taken by the Reich Research Council. Wartime medicine bending ethics into logistics. Ravensbruck, the female testing ground, supplies neat columns to a central office chasing a proof that refuses to appear. In a Berlin folder, a 12-page Fischer report graphs infection curves that stubbornly overlap between treated and untreated arms, its legend a quiet indictment of the thesis. Inside the camp, the denial is operational. Repeat under stricter controls. Under the lamps, the next incision opens. By autumn, Block 32 smells of phenol and iron. Names collect on the edge of a bunk. Anna, Bronisława, Selina, scratched with a nail by women who refuse to let the ledger be the only record. Prisoner to prisoner whispers track patterns more honestly than the charts. Who worsened after a dressing change, who survived when a dose was increased, who never came back from the second bone test. The ward's calendar ignores the first frost. Infections do not. A guard calls roll. The clerk flips another page. 90 seconds later, a new line in the ledger begins with a number in place of a name. Outside, observers continue to look away. Intercepts that mention Polish subjects are prioritized below bomb targets. Inspectors who see crowded infirmary rows write standard measures and move on. The system runs on time. It runs on signatures. It runs on a design that calls itself science while discarding the single premise science demands: consent. In this winter of 1943, the experiment has everything it needs except truth, and truth is already growing in a different archive. The memories of 74 Polish women who understand that their scars are testimony in waiting. The ascent is not only in procedures but in proof. Each initial by Fischer, each dressing mark by Oberheiser, each typed header citing Gebhardt's authority adds a layer that will one day be read aloud in a courtroom. Ignored, dismissed, archived under classified, until the files are opened and the women who endured them step forward to translate the numbers back into human time. April 1945. Soviet artillery rolls like distant thunder while the smoke of hurried burning stains the Ravensbrück sky. In the administrative bunker, stacks of ledgers and carbon copies curl in the flames, but paper does not always die when ordered. A metal box stamped sulfonamide Ravensbruck tumbles from a cart during evacuation. A junior clerk hesitates, then flees. Hours later, a Red Army patrol opens the box with a bayonet and finds what the fire missed. Typed protocols listing Polish prisoners by number, incision lengths, inocula of Streptococcus and Clostridium, temperature schedules and signatures, Fischer, Oberhäuser, beneath headings that cite Karl Gebhardt's authority from Berlin. Beside the forms lie photographs of swollen limbs and sutured bones, and a slim envelope of glass slide labels with dates that match the ledgers. The air in Block 32 still smells of phenol and iron. On a cot, a woman with a brace introduces herself with a number before a name, 4567. Wanda, she adds, and when a Soviet medical officer reads aloud, incision left thigh, sulfonamide, withheld, she nods once as if meeting her own file. Liberation unspools evidence in layers. In the commandant's office, a drawer sticks on a nail and, forced open, spills a ribbon-bound set of copies. Quarterly reports summarizing the sulfonamide series, rates of infection unchanged between treated and control arms, notes recommending repeat under stricter controls. In a side safe, a carbon of a 1943 approval from higher authority authorizes use of expendable Polish subjects for wound research in the language of logistics. In the Riviere, survivors produce their own archives. Scraps of protocol carbons smuggled under bandages, diary fragments sewn into seams, lists of numbers paired to nicked nerves and reopened cuts. A medical officer from the Polish forces arriving days later cross-checks scars with slide labels. Where the ledger says 3 centimeters, the leg says the same, puckered and stubborn. These are exhibits now, he tells a colleague, gesturing to a table where the metal box's contents lie in careful rows. The until that held for 3 years dissolves. A then takes its place. By early May, Allied legal staff move through the camp with crates and clipboards. A U.S. Army team catalogs what liberation could not burn: 300 glass slides of tissue, 80-plus death certificates with coy causes that align too neatly with operative dates, operative notes bearing Fischer's hand and Oberheiser's cursive on dressings, and comparative charts whose lines refuse to diverge. A 1944 report addressed to Gebhardt sits like a quiet admission. No decisive advantage demonstrated at current doses, followed by a proposal to triple them. On the same cohort, a Polish interpreter assembles affidavits from the living rabbits: Jadwiga Dzido, Władysława Karolewska, Maria Kusmierczuk, each pointing to the same room, the same sequence, The same signatures. They called us rabbits, one says. They called this science. The officer writing her words thinks in terms of chain of custody now. The paper and the scar will travel together. Beyond Ravensbrück, the macroskeleton of the network becomes visible as more sites are opened and files seized. Cross-references in Berlin show how Ravensbrück's pages fed a larger wartime research machine, seeking proof for a surgical doctrine that data would not grant. Intercepts and minutes, once dismissed as rumor or low-priority chatter, now align with carbon copies and photographs. When Allied prosecutors gather in a makeshift tent to plan the medical case, they spread the Ravensbrück ledger across a table and draw a simple line from heading to hand. Gebhardt's authority to Fischer's initials, to Oberheiser's notes, to a Polish woman's scar. The mathematics that began as columns of pain become a syllogism of guilt. The ignored, dismissed, until then turn crystallizes in the courtroom months later. In Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, exhibit numbers hang off folders and photographs as if they were new names. A temperature chart from Block 32, carefully dotted, meticulously timed, sits on an easel beside the living witness whose leg produced it. The prosecutor traces the line. Fever rising in both the drug and no-drug arms. Where is the effect? He asks. The answer is a silence that indicts. A surgeon points at an X-ray and explains how a nerve nick became a nerve cut. Why function did not return as the protocol optimistically forecast. A handwriting expert matches signatures to staff rosters. A pathologist aligns slide labels with bodies. The women align numbers with their own names, reclaiming identity from the ledger's anonymity. Papers once stamped classified now classify their authors. The legal record locks into place. Karl Gebhardt stands accused not of vague wartime necessity, but of specific designs executed on specific bodies without consent. War crimes and crimes against humanity. His associates are named in the same breath. Fritz Fischer, operative signatures throughout. Herta Oberhäuser, dressings and injections that advanced protocols rather than healing people. The tribunal hears that at least 74 Polish women were cut according to plan. At least a dozen died during or soon after, and many more suffered permanent disability. When defense counsel attempts to broaden the frame to total war, the prosecutor narrows it back to the sheet on the easel, to the incision length, to the inoculum, to the absence of consent line items that never existed because nobody asked. The court learns a vocabulary the victims already knew: comparison arm, endpoint, risk, then learns the words that replace them: coercion, mutilation, murder. Outside the chamber, the Ravensbrück archive is boxed, labeled, and moved to vaults where the temperature is controlled the way it should have been on the ward. To preserve, not to inflict. Journalists write about rabbits and sulfonamide, turning laboratory jargon into public witness. In Warsaw and Krakow, survivors listen to trial broadcasts and recognize their pain in the cadence of legal English. Our ledgers won, one says to another in a crowded kitchen, because they never imagined we would read them back to the world. This is the dramatic turn promised in the title. What the experimenters imagined as proof for surgery becomes proof against them. What they recorded to justify harm becomes the grammar of condemnation. Dismissed in 1942, doubted in 1943, hidden in 1944, their papers stand in 1946 as the scaffold of the Nuremberg Code. From these exhibits will come 10 sentences that begin to tell medicine what the women of Ravensbrück already knew. Consent is the first principle, and without it, there is only a ledger of pain. November 17, 1945, Hamelin Prison. A gallows silhouette cuts through fog as sentences from the Belsen trial are carried out. It is a prelude, not a finale. Months later, in Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, the medical case opens under bright lamps that turn paper into witness. On a long table lie the Ravensbrück files, protocol sheets for 74 Polish women, photographs of sutured bones, temperature charts that refuse to show the promised drug effect, and signatures. Fritz Fischer's precise strokes, Herta Oberhäuser's cursive, headings that place Karl Gebhardt's authority above them all. The tribunal calls the first of the Polish survivors. A woman steps forward and names herself by number and name, then lifts a skirt hem to reveal the scar that matches an entry on Exhibit 240. The courtroom learns to read the body as archive. Telford Taylor for the prosecution frames the charge simply, not medicine but crimes. War crimes and crimes against humanity. Engineered with the language of science. Consent is absent from every page, he says, tapping a protocol sheet where no signature line exists for the subject. Leo Alexander, the medical advisor, translates method into morality. These designs lacked equipoise, minimized no risk, and were never justified by prior knowledge. Here, he says, pointing to a graph from Ravensbrück, is the null result that cost women their limbs. A surgeon explains the difference between a nerve nick and a nerve cut, and why the latter, documented in the file, makes recovery a fiction. The court watches a film of x-rays and still photographs from the ward. Numbers become narratives. Narrative becomes law. Karl Gebhardt stands in the dock. The indictment names specific acts at Ravensbruck. Controlled wound infections seeded with dirt and glass. Sulfonamide versus control comparisons without consent. Tibial bone windows chiseled for observation. Nerve injuries created to study failure masquerading as recovery. The panel hears that at least 74 Polish prisoners were operated upon under this program. At least a dozen died during or soon after. Many more suffered permanent disability. Facts carried by exhibits and by women who survived to speak. Gebhardt's defense. Military necessity, superior orders, medical advancement. Collapses as charts are matched to scars and protocols to outcomes. Your data do not heal, a prosecutor says, they only memorialize harm. Fritz Fischer's initials appear on operative lines throughout. Herta Oberhäuser's signatures ride the bottom corners of dressing notes and medication orders. Their roles are not abstractions. They are ink and habit. Sentences will later reflect that. Fischer to prison, Oberhäuser to prison, and permanent disbarment from medicine. For Gebhardt, the tribunal's language is final. Guilt on counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sentence of death. On June 2, 1948, he is hanged. The rope is not the end of a story. It is punctuation after the code has already been read into the record. That code, 10 sentences spoken into modern medicine, emerges during these months from the convergence of paper and pain. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The voice reading it aloud is calm, but the words carry the heat of Block 32's lamps and the chill of Ravensbruck's mornings. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease. A surgeon from the tribunal nods toward the graph that showed no drug effect at all. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved. A survivor looks down at a leg that never healed and understands that sentence was written for her and because of her. Psychological consequences carry beyond verdicts. In Warsaw, group therapy circles in 1950 trace nightmares back to the precise moment a chisel touched bone. Clinicians learn to listen for the sound of a typewriter in a patient's pauses. Studies count high rates of post-traumatic disorder among survivors, but the numbers do not capture the quiet decisions that knit lives together. Adopting children, returning to study, testifying again when asked. The rabbits teach doctors how to hear scars. They also teach lawyers how to weigh them. Legally, the doctor's trial resets the map. Crimes against humanity expand to name mutilation in the language of law. The 1949 Geneva Conventions absorb the lesson. No medical experiment on prisoners, no biological harm disguised as care. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki echoes the first point of the code and then elaborates: institutional review, independent oversight. In 1979, the Belmont Report hammers justice into the template. No group consigned to harm for the putative good of others. What began as a ledger in Block 32 ends as a checklist in every research boardroom that asks, before any cut, who consents and why. Ethically, debates flare and settle along the line the code draws. Could any insight be salvaged from the Ravensbrück sulfonamide series? Methodologists and ethicists examine the curves and the notes and agree. The design is tainted at the root. No consent, flawed controls, manipulated temperatures. The correct use of these papers is as warning, not as reference. Medical schools teach the rabbits as case zero for harm masquerading as method. Exhibit numbers migrate into curricula. A generation learns that science without humanity is merely organized cruelty. For the survivors, memorials replace ledgers. Stones are inscribed with names, not numbers. A plaque at Ravensbrück lists the 74 Polish women of the surgical cohort. On anniversaries, families read those names aloud. Some bring photocopies of the protocol pages not to honor them, but to prove they were real, that the next generation can touch the paper and then touch the scar the paper named. In archives, curators file the Ravensbruck box beside the trial transcripts. A note on the finding aid reads, "From evidence to ethics." The moral lines are plain. Dismissed as rumor until the archives opened, Gebhardt's experiments became the hinge on which modern research turned. The tribunal pronounced guilt, but the code pronounced prevention. From Block 32 to every consent form in circulation, the ARC holds: ignored, then condemned, dismissed, then codified, pain recorded, then transformed into principle. Summer 1946, Nuremberg. The corridors smell of polished oak and fatigue. The doctor's trial opens like a careful incision, and the Polish rabbit's archive becomes the scalpel. Wanda Wilczewska, 28, steel brace on a leg mapped by scars, steps to the stand and introduces herself first by number, then by name, an act of reclamation. "Describe consent," Telford Taylor asks. "There was none," she replies. The protocol decided. Our bodies were the signature. She lifts her skirt. A rope of scar shines under the lights and finds its twin in a photograph marked Ravensbruck, Block 32, date and time stamped. Flanking her, Maria Kuzmierczuk and Helena Kriskiewicz add layers. A schedule of temperatures that did not spare them fever. Dressings changed to observe infection rather than to heal it. A bone window that never closed clean. Their words do more than wound. They draft. In the prosecution room, Leo Alexander leans over the Ravensbrück bundle and turns procedure into principle. He circles a graph in which sulfonamide and control curves overlap. Beside it, he writes, "No anticipated benefit, unjustified risk." He underlines a line where a nerve nick became a nerve cut and writes, "No therapeutic intent." Point by point, the code begins to breathe in the margins. Voluntary consent, scientific design, favorable risk-benefit, freedom to withdraw, qualified investigators. Defense's attempt to fog the lens. Karl Brandt speaks of total war. Counsel invokes orders and necessity. The panel answers with exhibits. A protocol page without a consent line sits next to a survivor's scar. An X-ray of a tibia window sits next to a pathologist's slide. A temperature chart that never diverged sits next to a surgeon's testimony on null results. The court watches as Gebhardt's name on the heading becomes responsibility, as Fischer's initials become presence, as Oberheiser's signatures become participation. The argument that it was science dies of its own records. Outside the chamber, transformation accelerates. Survivors meet in cramped pension rooms to plan what comes after verdicts, mutual aid, memorials, and law. Wanda helps found a Warsaw group in 1947 that will lobby ministries to embed the new principles in permits and hospitals. Helena, once a nurse, enrolls in medical ethics and begins to teach with the authority of pain. Maria speaks in Geneva about what a protocol looks like from the table rather than the desk. They insist on forms that name the person, on committees that stop a cut before it begins. They insist on language, voluntary, informed, uncoerced. Conferences absorb the lesson and argue its edges. In 1948, a delegate asks whether tainted data can serve the living. The answer returns from the Ravensbrück charts themselves: manipulation, absence of consent, design defects. The correct use of this archive is sentinel, not source. Journals print the code's sentences in sober fonts. Medical schools begin courses with the rabbit story because no abstract principle teaches like a scar that matches a line on a page. By the early 1950s, institutions respond. Hospitals form review committees long before the acronyms fix in law. International bodies weave the code's sentences into new fabric. The Geneva Conventions codify protections for prisoners. The Declaration of Helsinki revisits and elaborates the trial's vocabulary. By 1979, the Belmont Report hammers justice into policy. so no population is again selected for harm because power can reach them. In these rooms, the Ravensbrück bundle sits as a kind of relic, not holy but cautionary. A reminder that paperwork can be a weapon or a shield depending on whose name is missing. Memory work follows law. Survivors record testimony on tape. Curators mount photographs not to sensationalize but to stabilize truth. A plaque at Ravensbrück lists the 74, and each reading of the names is a small repeal of the ledger's anonymity. In classrooms, a lecturer writes the first line of the code on the board and then reads a fragment from a protocol page that lacks it, letting the absence sound louder than any speech. From dragged to deciding, one rabbit says in a 1960s hall, and the audience understands the arc. The code is not an essay, it is a doorway. It opens in a courtroom in 1947, but it stays open in every clinic that asks permission and can hear no. In this block of years, the Polish survivors are not the end of a story, but the beginning of a standard. Their endurance becomes architecture. Their scars become grammar. Their names replace their numbers on the documents of a world that, at last, learns how to write consent before it writes a cut. October 1990, a fluorescent-lit room at Harvard Medical School. On a long table, yellowed photocopies of Ravensbrück protocols sit beside modern journals. The panel is titled Nazi Data, Salvage, or Sanctity, and the first speaker to move the air is a Polish survivor with a brace that has outlived empires. Maria Kusmierczuk sets down a 1944 chart from the sulfonamide series, the kind that once promised to justify a doctrine and instead became evidence. These curves cost lives, she says, tapping the overlapping lines that never separated drug from control. An ethicist nods. The debate opens. A pharmacologist raises a familiar conditional: if some wartime datasets aided survival elsewhere, could this one be parsed for good? The answer comes from the documents themselves. A methodologist points at temperature entries smudged by haste and by intent, at intervals designed to prove rather than to learn. Consent is absent, design is defective, and records are manipulated, he says. This is not a trove. It is a warning. The room settles around a consensus that mirrors the trial's verdicts. The right use of Ravensbrück is to prevent repetition, not to extract citation. Across the 1990s, committees and classrooms formalize what the code implied. Medical schools teach the rabbit's case as the 0 point where protocol became indictment. IRBs harden their checklists: clear consent language, genuine equipoise, independent monitoring, documented right to withdraw. When a study proposes risk without necessity, a reviewer writes a single word in the margin learned from 1947. No. Professional bodies issue guidance barring the clinical use of data born of coercion and fraud. Archives tag such documents not as sources but as artifacts of harm. Personal arcs fold into institutional memory. Maria speaks again in Geneva about consent that must account for vulnerability, so no group is chosen because it cannot flee. Helena's bequeathed tibia X-ray becomes a teaching slide in Krakow, a lighted square that turns a protocol line back into a person. Wanda's family records an oral history that begins with a number and ends with a principle. The subject decides. Memorials digitize the Ravensbrück collections. A new generation scrolls through scans of signatures that once floated above anonymous bodies and now answer to names. In the sciences, the code's spine holds even as fields mutate. Genomics finds its guardrails in its sentences. Voluntary, informed, proportional. When an experiment proposes to sort humans by invented hierarchies, ethicists point to a page from 1947 rather than a hypothesis from 1943 and close the file. When emergencies tempt shortcuts, committees remember how quickly necessity can become a solvent. The vocabulary of consent becomes the grammar of algorithms, choices presented plainly, opt-outs real, oversight external. Museums and textbooks complete the translation. Exhibits place a protocol sheet beside a consent form, inviting the viewer to see the gulf and the bridge. Captions resist sensational detail and insist on precise language. 74 Polish women operated upon in the sulfonamide bone nerve program directed under Karl Gebhardt. At least a dozen died during or soon after. Many more were permanently disabled. Students learn the first point of the code not as a slogan, but as the only humane beginning to any method, absolutely essential. By 2025, much of the vigilance is automated, but not automatic. Software checks protocols against rules that began as sentences read aloud in 1947. A red flag on a dashboard is a distant echo of a survivor's "no" finally heard. The logic is simple and hard-won. Data without dignity is not knowledge. Design without consent is not science. The Ravensbrück bundle survives because its purpose changed. Once a project file, now a perimeter fence. The ledger of harm has become a ledger of protection. From 74 operated upon to billions shielded by review and consent, the line runs through a courtroom where paper and scar were read together. The legacy is not in what the curves once claimed to show. It is in the refusal, learned there, to let any curve erase the person who makes it. December 1947. The frost on the windows of the Palace of Justice has not melted by the time the last gavel falls in the doctor's trial. 16 convicted, 7 sentenced to hang, and between verdict and sentence the 10 points are read into the record, like a counterspell to what the files described at Ravensbrück. A reporter asks what changed. The prosecutor answers by holding up paper, protocols for 74 Polish women, photographs of cut bone, charts where drug and control lines march together. Dismissed as wartime necessity, he says, until the evidence branded it a crime. The comparison writes itself. Before the code, a void, memos authorizing expendable subjects, inspectors calling testimony rumor, research that used the word design to hide the word coercion. After the code, a spine, voluntary consent, scientific justification, proportional risk, the right to withdraw. Points that move from courtroom to clinic, as if following a map the survivors drew with scars. By 1949, conventions outlaw mutilation in the language states understand. By 1964, physicians sign their professional names beneath sentences traced to a ward where no patient ever signed. By 1979, committees seated in ordinary hospitals act as sentries at the threshold of every proposed cut. The rabbits are not coda, they are chorus. 74 operated upon, at least a dozen dead during or soon after, many more disabled for life. Yet by 1947, 60-plus survivors speak into microphones and fix their pain to exhibits. Their affidavits do not ask for pity, they demand architecture. From dragged to deciding, one says after the reading of the code, and the room understands that a principle has found its voice. Medical schools later teach the case not for its gore, but for its grammar. How a ledger became law. Fraud sits in the archive as part of the indictment. Operative notes that promised effect where none appeared. Temperatures logged to flatter a thesis. A proposal to triple doses when curves overlapped. The files do not only show harm, they show method bent into propaganda. This is why the code's first point is absolute, not qualified. It is why consent is not a box to tick but the beginning of science. The lesson is cold and bright. Data without dignity is not knowledge, and results born of coercion cannot be redeemed by citation. Stand now at the present tense and the line still holds. Protocols in 2025 carry echoes of sentences read in 1947. Screens flash red when designs take risks they cannot justify. When language blurs choice, when recruitment hunts the vulnerable. A young researcher reads the first point aloud in a meeting and realizes it is not an oath. It is a boundary. In a memorial hall in Berlin, a visitor reads a name from a plaque, one of the 74, and then sees a scanned protocol page under glass. Between them stands the code. The moral is not ornamental, it is operational. Gebhardt's experiments at Ravensbrück were built to convince a war that pain could be measured into truth. The archive proved otherwise. What was ignored became undeniable. What was dismissed became the foundation of a rule that outlives its authors. Science is not saved by results, it is saved by restraints. And the restraint that matters, learned from a ward where the word consent never appeared, is this. The human subject decides. The rest is procedure.